Thank you for listening to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. To send me an email, please use rearviewmirrorchronicles@gmail.com, and to send me a message on WhatsApp, +60 16 425 6301. Tullius crouched at his side, holding out his petition. Impatiently, Caesar waved it away. And then, quite unexpectedly, Tullius grabbed hold of the dictator's purple-lined toga and yanked it down. Utter bewilderment flashed across Julius Caesar's face. "This is violence," he shouted. Something darted towards his neck. A blinding pain, a smear of red. Half turning, he saw blood dripping from a dagger. There were people crowding around him now, familiar faces, friends he had trusted for years. They all held knives. Their eyes were hard. More steel flashed towards him. His head was whirling. He raised his hands to shield himself and saw the blood running down his arms. Now he was twisting, cornered, a beast at bay. He could hear somebody bellowing, a monstrous roar of fear and panic, and he recognized his own voice. He was trapped. He couldn't get up. There was blood everywhere. The faces were coming closer. The knives rose and fell. And then, to his relief, he saw Brutus. Good old Brutus. But Brutus's eyes were hollow, and in his hand was another knife. "Et tu, Brute," Caesar said, disbelieving. "You too, my boy?" Hello, and welcome to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. My name is Keith Hockton. I'm a public historian, author, and broadcaster. So that is one of the most famous scenes in all of history. The assassination of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March in 44 BC at the Theatre of Pompey in Rome. It's probably one of, and I hate to use the word iconic because it's so cliched and such an overused word, but it's such an iconic moment. It's been repeated in painting after painting, play after play, and countless films. This was the murder of the most famous man in the world. When you think of Caesar and his legions, think of the movie Gladiator and the opening scene where General Maximus Decimus Meridius, played by Russell Crowe brilliantly, I must say, faces off against the Germanic tribes. His captain, looking at the fierce army gathered at the edge of the forest, just 400 meters away, beating their shields and waving their swords and spears, says, "A people should know when they are conquered." Maximus Decimus looks at him and says, "Would you?" Ladies and gentlemen, this was Rome at its greatest. Caesar conquered the tribes of France and then Britain. No mean feat. He won 8 major battles, commanding roughly 40,000 battle-hardened legionnaires per battle. He was a hands-on leader who fought with his troops on the front line, showing amazing physical endurance and courage. That he was killed by cowards in his Senate. Gaius Julius Caesar is a figure of immense historical significance, and he's celebrated for a combination of not just his military prowess and his political acumen, but also for his charisma and his leadership. His military genius was evident in the Gallic Wars, where he expanded Rome's territory and demonstrated strategic brilliance, notably at the Battle of Alesia. Politically, Caesar was a skilled operator, forging alliances from a very early age and rising to power as dictator for life. He was also a prolific writer, one of the things that I love about him because we know so much about that age and era because of his writing, and he left behind a very valuable historical account showcasing his eloquence. Interestingly, I think we know more about the events of the Ides of March than we do of any other day, in fact, of Roman history. And we can talk about it in some detail, but it's also big because it polarizes all sorts of political issues that reverberate through Roman history. In some way, it's the kind of great bottleneck in Roman history between the age of when Rome was a republic and when it became an autocracy, but also for future generations, for future centuries. And again, the question of whether Caesar's murder was justified or whether it was a crime is something that people have debated, well, for 2,000 years. And that act has actually animated revolutionaries right the way to the present day. And of course, it's been retold so many times, and perhaps in the English-speaking world because, of course, it's the theme of Shakespeare's play. And in Shakespeare's play, it's so exquisitely balanced between whether Brutus or Cassius, the two principal conspirators, particularly Brutus, whether he's justified in what he does or whether he has committed a terrible crime. And this is the interesting thing about doing a podcast like this. By the end of it, you'll get to make up your mind. You'll get to make your opinion. And if you'd like to send that through to me, I'd love to hear it. I think the issues are perennial and irresolvable ultimately. But it's also, of course, a key event in the context of Roman history because it effectively, it marks the end of a very, very distinctive period in Roman history, which is that for centuries, Rome has been a republic. And the conspirators murder Caesar because they think that he has made himself supreme within the context of the republic. And so they're actually worried that he's going to destroy it. And they kill him to try and rescue the republic. But the great tragedy, and again, this is why this event is so resonant to the great tragedy of their attempt, is that they end up destroying what they have been attempting to save. For those people who are new to this, Caesar was actually born in 100 BC or thereabouts, and he is from a very rich and very noble family. And just why is it that Caesar, more than anybody else, comes to personify in the minds of his assassins the threat to the Republic? The key to the success of the Republic over the course of its centuries of existence is that it has been absolutely brilliant in providing scope for its most ambitious men to do great things on behalf of the city, while at the same time channeling and framing them so that the ambitions of these men didn't come to put the whole of the Republic in their shadow. For the Romans, the word king was an incredibly dirty word. The Republic, rather like the American Republic, has been founded with the expulsion of a monarchy. And so the idea that a single man could rise to power within the Republic is every Roman's worst nightmare. And so the entire structure of government has been fashioned to ensure that that didn't happen. So the powers of the king had to be given to two officials called consuls. Each consul would have power for a single year. And then there were lesser magistrates. So below the consuls, they were magistrates called praetors, who were kind of deputies, and so on all the way down. It was very well ordered. And the idea was that if you have the wealth, if you have the background, if you have the prestige, if you have the popularity within the voters, you will ascend up this terribly greasy pole. You would go up this chain of magistratees and ultimately become a consul, and then hopefully win glory for Rome by conquering Gaul or Great Britain. But you would then accept the fact that you had had your time in the sun and it was time for you to stand down and to let someone else have a go. And this was the way that the Republic had always functioned. And it made it incredibly successful because the ambitions of these men were what enabled them to expand through Italy, across the Mediterranean, and become the greatest power that the Western world had ever seen. What happens in the first century BC when Caesar is born is that the Republic has become so powerful, so huge, that institutions and frameworks of government that have worked very well when Rome was a city-state in Italy is starting to come under pressure and strain. And one of the things that becomes very evident is that the old days of allowing someone to have a command for a single year is totally inadequate for the scale and sweep of Rome's empire. And that, in turn, is threatening for the Republic because it means that one man might be given a command that lasts longer than a year. And that, of course, enables him to win the loyalty of his soldiers, his legionnaires, and in the long run to put the whole Republic in his shadow. And the first person who really does that is Pompey the Great, who is, from his teenage years, he's incredibly successful. And this is immediately threatening to the Roman state because the idea is that you can only win certain magistry when you've reached a certain age. So for me, for instance, at my age, well, it would never happen. It's an ominous kind of moment. But for Romans, it's a great celebration because when you're 40, you can actually become a consul. Pompey, of course, ignored this. He had been after commands right from his teenage years, and he has spent years in the East annexing wealthy Greek kingdoms, bringing them into the Republic. And when he comes back to Rome, he's kind of trailing. He's got kings in his train. He's got great chests of treasure, all kinds of things like that. And he's rich, overly rich, probably one of the richest men on earth, and way too rich for the Roman system. Pompey at this stage is a figure of menacing power in the context of the Republic, but he's also inherently a conservative figure. He wants to be acknowledged as princeps, the chief man of the state, but he doesn't want to overthrow the Republic or anything like that. He's far too conventional. So he enters into an alliance with two other very heavyweight figures. One of them is Crassus, who's also incredibly wealthy, also from the kind of same background as Pompey. He's emerged from a civil war, and eventually he ends up dead fighting the Parthians out to the east, and his head is actually used as a prop in a drama by the Parthians and all that kind of things. You know, they have it hanging around the court as a bit of a jest. It's like, you know, look what that guy tried to do and look where he ended up. But the third figure is Julius Caesar, who is also very ambitious, and his family can actually claim their descent all the way back to the goddess Venus. His family haven't actually been big players through the course of Roman history. And so Caesar is very, very anxious that he should live up to the glamour and the glory of his divine descent. And he recognizes that the only way really to become a great man in the context of the Republic now is not to play by their rules, but to do what Pompey has done and to grab a command. And his command, his first command, he gets 5 years and then ultimately 10 years in Gaul, in what's now France. This is also where he did most of his writing. He conquers France with ease, and with this, he actually becomes as rich as Pompey has become. And he also has a large number of very battle-hardened legionnaires who are devoted to him at his back. And his enemies in Rome try and back him into a corner. They try to strip him of his command. Caesar has this excruciating dilemma. Does he lay down his command and risk persecution, but not break the law? Or does he break the law and cross this tiny river that marks the limit of his Gallic provinces, the Rubicon, and effectively declare civil war? And that's what he chooses to do. Pompey, despite being regarded with great suspicion by the traditional conservative senatorial elite, he takes the command of senatorial cause against Caesar. He then withdraws from Italy to Greece because he doesn't have the legionnaires that Caesar has for an immediate confrontation in Italy. Caesar follows him, defeats him in battle at a place called Pharsalus, and Pompey flees, ending up murdered in Egypt. Caesar then spends his time pursuing, basically he has two groups of enemies. He has Pompeians. So Pompey has two sons, and they want to continue the fight against him. And he also has, these traditionalists, these people who see Caesar as a menace, as an aberration, a would-be king. And they have deep ideological reasons for continuing to fight him. The key opponent, oddly, is someone who doesn't really have a great command. He also doesn't have a great track record of magistrates. He's not a major military figure, but he is a person who made himself absolutely the embodiment of everything that conservatives and traditionalists in the Republic admire about Rome and about their system of government. And this is a man called Cato. Cato has always been Caesar's great enemy, and they come to be seen as the two greatest figures in the Republic. So there's a follower of Caesar who in due course writes about them, a historian actually called Sallust. He writes about these two great men, and he says, there appeared two men remarkable for their qualities, very different though they were in character. And it's these differences in character that amplifies the sense that Romans have a significance of both. So they both embody a set of values. Caesar is the absolute showman who loves playing to the crowds, and Cato is the incarnation of Republican austerity. I mean this obviously as an analogy. You might compare them to the difference between someone like Donald Trump and John McCain. For American listeners, Caesar is a flamboyant populist. He is prepared to trample down on the conventions and the norms of the Republic and do so knowing that it's going to appeal to a substantial base. But he's not vulgar. He's definitely not vulgar. He's a very, very educated, sophisticated man, but he's definitely flamboyant, and he is unafraid to cut a dash. Cato, on the other hand, is the absolute opposite. He is kind of hewn out of granite. When he meets foreign dignitaries, and this is very Cato, he does so sitting on the toilet. There's no airs and graces. He's actually making a point about the fact that he is contemptuous of anything that is flash, anything that might be faintly, redolent of monarchy. And he detests Caesar, and Caesar detests him just as much. And in the build-up to the Rubicon, it's basically Cato's obduracy that prevents a compromise from being struck. Cato is as complicit in the outbreak of civil war as Caesar is. And so in the spring of 46, so this is actually 2 or 3 years after the beginning of the civil war, Caesar comes to Africa, where one of his great enemies, a guy called Metellus Scipio, who is basically a kind of vicious non-entity, who's actually chiefly famous for his particular talent for staging pornographic floor shows. But when it comes to military competency, he's absolutely hopeless. And he's leading the anti-Caesarian forces in Africa, and he gets defeated at a place called Thapsus. Now, Cato, he is in command of a town that is just down the coast from Thapsus, a small place called Utica. And he's brought the news that Caesar has won at the Battle of Thapsus, and he doesn't know what to do or to say. Yet again, Caesar has triumphed. He knows that there's no way of carrying on the fight. That's evident. So what does he do? He has the choice of submitting to Caesar, and he knows that Caesar will pardon him. And to us, that's something that's incredibly attractive about Caesar, his magnanimity. It's an extraordinary thing. He's a very generous man to his former opponents. So he's both formidable in battle, but he's also very forgiving. Clementia, the Romans call it, and that's where we get the word clemency. But for Cato and for people like him, Caesar's magnanimity is incredibly offensive, because this is the quality that a master might show his slaves. It's a quality that a king might show his subjects. And so to be forgiven by your peer in battle is unbelievably humiliating. For Cato to be forgiven by Caesar would be, a horror beyond compares. And so he decides that he's going to kill himself instead. And he invites his friends around to dinner, and they have an incredible discussion on the kinds of, philosophical themes. And it's a very nice dinner by all accounts. And then he goes upstairs and he stabs himself in the stomach. But he doesn't do it very competently. He's found his friends try and stitch up his stomach. They manage to do it. They then leave him alone, thinking that he's going to be fine. When he wakes, he pulls open the stitching, pulls out his guts, and dies a very horribly but very nobly death. The following day, Caesar arrives in Utica. He's shown Cato's corpse, and he kind of stands over the body and says, "Just as you envied me the chance of sparing you, Cato, so I envy you this death." And there is this sense that although Caesar has defeated all of his other enemies, Cato, in a sense, has actually defeated him by not submitting, by not playing by Caesar's rules. And within weeks of it being reported back in Rome, Cato has become a kind of victorious emblem, even in defeat. And of course, that angers Caesar even more. And this is something that will reverberate through Roman history. And Lucan, who writes a great epic about the civil war in the time of Nero, he has this famous phrase, "Vitrix caus et dies placuit victor Catone." The gods favored the winning cause, but Cato favored the defeated one. So Cato, in a sense, his opinion, his approval is even more important than that of the gods. And this for Caesar is infuriating, and it prompts him to make a mistake. So when he gets back to Rome from Africa, he stages 4 great triumphs or military processions through the streets of Rome. Keep in mind, Caesar plays to the crowds. He celebrates his victories in Gaul. He celebrates his victories in Egypt. This is the kind of Cleopatra imbroglio. He celebrates victories in Asia, where he has his famous phrase, "Vene, vidi, vici." I came, I saw, I conquered. A very, very quick victory. And this is a kind of a gloat over Pompey, because Pompey has made his name in Asia. And Caesar is basically saying, conquering Asia, it's nothing. I mean, anyone could win a victory here. And then he celebrates his victory in Africa. and it's very, very offensive to contemplate that anyone might celebrate a triumph over fellow Romans. So Caesar is pretending that in Africa he's been fighting Africans, but of course he hasn't. He's actually been fighting Romans. He draws a veil over that. But because Cato has basically kind of driven him mad, as he's the one guy who's, got under his skin, through the streets of Rome during his triumph, a float is drawn that illustrates the suicide of Cato. And the impact of this on the watching crowds who normally are very pro-Caesar, Caesar is bestowing great largesse, on them. And he does, many parades, and it's all great fun and all of the above. But at the sight of this float, the crowds weep, and Caesar is furious. Cato still haunts him from the grave. And then Caesar goes off to Spain because the sons of Pompey the Great are there still holding out. This is going to be the last holdout for those who are resisting Caesar. And back in Rome, a figure decides that he is going to write a eulogy for Cato. And this figure is very close to Caesar. He's called Marcus Junius Brutus. He is the son of Servilia, who is Caesar's great love. In fact, his greatest love. Almost like his schoolboy crush, or his girlfriend when he was young, his first love. And they've had an ongoing relationship for a long time. And she's the woman who he is most fond of. And there are actually rumors that Brutus might be Caesar's son. So you'd think that in the Civil War, Brutus, because of Caesar's relationship with Servilia, would immediately have sided with Caesar, but he doesn't, because he is actually Cato's nephew. And so he is inspired by Cato's example to oppose Caesar. At the Battle of Pharsalus, where Caesar defeats Pompey, Caesar is actually very anxious about what happened to Brutus on the battlefield and orders search parties to go and find him. And when they find that he hasn't been killed, he's brought to Caesar's tent and Caesar hugs him. Caesar pardons him. He bestows honors on him, and Brutus is now very much part of the regime that Caesar is trying to set up. This again shows Caesar in an extraordinarily magnanimous light, because lots of people in history that I've talked about, over these podcasts, over the ensuing months, have been punished with this type of action by instant death or torture or exile. I mean, what an extraordinary insight into Caesar's psychology. I think it's a genuinely sympathetic aspect of Caesar's character. He's not a tyrant. He doesn't put people to death. He raises Pompey's statues, which have been toppled by his troops and followers. And, he actually shows this clementia, which to someone like Cato is deeply offensive. But it's better than being killed. Surely it's better being pardoned and given honors. So is Brutus a lovable person? Look, I mean, he comes across as quite conservative too. He's a sort of a wannabe Cato in many ways. He's very earnest. He's very dutiful. He's very deep thinking. He's a philosopher. He's also descended from the man who overthrew the monarchy at the beginning of the Republic. This is another reason why I think he sides with the senatorial elite, and why the example of Cato's death, his uncle's death, has a particular impact on him. And so in the wake of that, he divorces his wife and then marries Cato's daughter. He's effectively pinning his colors to the mast. And he's a bit obsessed with Cato. He's making a striking statement. And Portia, who is Cato's daughter, is absolutely a chip off the old block. I mean, she's the model of upstanding Roman matrony. And they make a very kind of moral and slightly chilly, forbidding pair, I think. And to be honest, I don't know whether I would have invited them to a dinner party. When you play that dinner party, the 10 most famous people that you'd invite. I don't think they'd be on my list. Well, look, they might be if you wanted to discuss Roman philosophy, and discourse on ancient Roman history and things like that. But not for me. Brutus also writes an obituary for Cato, and he gets someone else to write one as well. Someone who is not naturally brave, who's been hunkering down, who's been basically kind of wringing his hands, wishing that the whole thing would go away. And this is Rome's most celebrated orator, a man called Cicero. Cicero is a man who is basically an out-of-towner. None of his forebears have made it to the Senate. He is the guy who has not only made it in the Senate, but ended up as consul. And he's always kind of, very conscious of the fact that he's in the shadow of people who are grander, who are kind of more elevated, more senatorial than him. And he's had a kind of chilly relationship with Cato. He's a little bit jealous of Cato. He can also see there's something faintly ridiculous about Cato, I think. Cicero is funny. He's alert. He's astute. And he's an intelligent man, but not naturally heroic at all. But he is persuaded by Brutus to do something that is moderately heroic, to kind of stick his neck out a little bit, and that is to also write a eulogy to Cato. The news of this is actually brought to Caesar in Spain, where the fighting is incredibly brutal. Again, go back to the opening scenes of Gladiator and you'll picture what Caesar was doing. And keep in mind, Caesar was a frontline leader. He was on the line fighting with his troops. So we talked about how Caesar is generally a magnanimous man, but in Spain, he's not at all. And it's this news that's brought to him from Rome that turns him. The fighting against Pompey's sons is very, very savage. And he wins in a spectacular battle, actually the last battle of the Civil War, in a place called Munda in March 45. And he then allows the corpses of his dead opponents, all of whom are Romans, all of whom are citizens of Rome, to basically be used as building materials, so that their bodies are kind of mulched up in the cement and, the dirt that Caesar is using to build his fortifications. I mean, the idea of headhunting is associated by the Romans with barbarians. The Germanicans, the Gauls, the British. It's not the kind of thing that Romans should be doing, but Caesar does it. He does it to set an example. He does it because he's fed up. He's fed up with this relentless opposition. And the news that is brought to him that Cicero, which is bad enough, but then Brutus has written these eulogies to Cato, he's furious. And he pens a riposte, anti-Cato, slagging Cato off, very unlike Caesar, trying to cast Cato in a negative light, as negative light as he possibly can. And he sends it back to Rome. It's a little bit like, when you get one of those emails that enrages you and you immediately sit down and you write an email back and you send it, and then you read it the following day and you think, ooh, I shouldn't have sent that. Whenever you get something like that, you should always sit back and leave it for 24 hours. And I get the feeling this is what Caesar should have done at this particular moment in time. But he doesn't, and he sends it back to Rome, and basically everyone laughs. And of course, that infuriates Caesar even more. So there is this sense that even though all Caesar's enemies have been killed, that Cato from beyond the grave is actually leading the opposition. And this kind of inspires people back in Rome who have been fighting Caesar behind the scenes, who may have accepted his pardon. But what this does is it reassures them. It also shames them into a sense that there is still a fight to be fought. So they are there in Rome, and Caesar has won in Spain. They expect him to hurry back, but he doesn't. And of course, this is another thing that offends the senatorial elite back in Rome. And let's just take a short break for a message from our sponsor. Altidomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much more than that. When you sign up with Altidomus, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Altidomus or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270, or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. And we are back. So from Spain, Caesar decides to go through southern Gaul, and while he's in Gaul, he offers citizenship to various Gallic luminaries, which is actually very forward-thinking policy when you take it into account. He actually has this sense that Rome is now a global empire, and so it's not enough that citizenship should belong only to the people in Rome, but citizenship should belong to the conquered nations of Italy and of Gaul. And Caesar is now handing it out to the people that he meets. And this is actually very offensive to the elites back in Rome. And you get the sense that Caesar actually did it because he knew it would be. And then Caesar marches into Italy, and he's met in Italy before he reaches Rome by Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, who he's actually got pregnant while he was in Alexandria, and who's turned up in Italy with their son. And it's all very unrepublican behavior because Cleopatra is Greek. She's a woman. She's a queen. I mean, it couldn't be more offensive to the senators that the fact that Caesar would prefer to spend time with her rather than them. And so he's hanging out with her, having a good time. And it's only in October. Keep in mind, the Battle of Munda was fought in March. It's only in October that he decides to come back to Rome. And the people of Rome, partly because Cleopatra is a foreign Greek queen of an extremely rich realm, one that for the Romans have come to represent luxury and corruption and so on, they see it as being very un-Roman, and they then start questioning, does Caesar actually want to make himself king? He's behaving in a very un-Roman way. And of course, there's a huge problem. How do you then digest the preponderance position that Caesar now has? I mean, it's much greater than Pompey had. He's put everyone in his shadow. Cicero says of him that, we are his slaves, but he is the slave of time. So there is some sympathy for the challenges that he faces, but not many. There's also a lot of hostility. How can someone who has all these legions at his back, how can he be molded into the fabric of the Republic? And the answer is the kind of classic Roman one, which is always in times of crisis. You don't look forward, you look backwards. And this is true even if someone is as radical and as daring as Caesar. So there is, in the frame of the Constitution of the Republic, there is scope for someone to be given supreme power, overriding the traditional system of magistracies for 6 months. And the name of this office is one that listeners will be very familiar with, one that I mentioned at the beginning of the show. It's dictator. The problem for us is, I think, when we hear the word dictator, we think of Hitler, we think of Stalin, we think of these African dictators, Idi Amin, we think of the dictators in South America. But you have to try and remove that from your mind. I know that's a hard thing to do, but you have to, because a dictator in Rome is someone who's actually appointed for a 6 month period to actually save the Republic. And it's happened in periodic intervals throughout Roman history, and it works. And it's constitutionally sanctioned. So it's not someone grabbing power. And Caesar, he's actually been appointed dictator for 11 days back in 49, in the wake of the crossing of the Rubicon. In October 48, he's been appointed dictator for a year. And then spring 46, at the same time, he's going off to fight, Scipio and then Cato in Africa. He's actually appointed dictator for 10 years. And this is an incredible honor to be given. And even though it's constitutionally given, it actually gives him the right to nominate all of the Republic's magistrates. He's given a master of horse, which is his deputy, who's a man called Lepidus. So Lepidus is given a military authority within Rome. Also, much to everyone's amusement, Caesar is created prefect of morals. Caesar, he's many, many things. He's many amazing things, but he's not a moral man. He's a massive shagger. He shags anything in sight. He's incredibly promiscuous. He just never stops. So the question is, are these positions sufficient to keep Caesar happy? Because this is what the senators are about. Keep him happy and keep him distracted. So when he comes to Rome, it's kind of evident that they're not really. They're not really sufficient for the preponderant role that Caesar has in the Republic. And so people start giving him ever more honors and ever more titles. But there's also a sense in which by doing that, it's a little bit like garlanding a sacrificial bull, because the more honors they give him, the more the Republic comes to seem a cipher. The more Caesar is provoking the envy and the hostility of his peers, with consequences that will play out very, very bloodily over the few months that remain of Caesar's life, following his return to Rome in October 45. So we're in the final stretch of the extraordinary and colorful, ultimately doomed life of Gaius Julius Caesar, who has become dictator in Rome. So what are his plans? What's he trying to do? He comes back and he displays kind of incredible, almost demonic energy that he's done throughout his entire life. And he is aware that Rome and the people of Rome face all kinds of problems. And so with the power that he now has as dictator for life, a power that the previous generations of Roman statesmen didn't have because they were always kind of having to watch their back and cope with the jealousies of people who were their peers, now Caesar can kind of basically force through what he wants. This is what Rome needs. So he plans all sorts of urban improvements. Pompey has built Rome's first theatre of stone, a vast, great structure. Caesar inevitably plans a theatre that's going to be larger than that. He also plans the largest temple in the world dedicated to Mars on the Campus Martius, which is traditionally the place where the people of Rome would gather for warfare, but has long since become the kind of place for urban development. He also plans to move the river Tiber to expedite his building schemes. So these are the kind of measures and the kind of self-confidence that he now has. He then famously revises the calendar. So the Julian calendar comes into effect. And this is the time when he's doing all of that. He also recognizes the need to boost grain supply because Rome is now a vast city of almost 1 million people. They need to be kept fed. And Caesar is concerned to improve the condition of the people. And that's why the people of Rome love him. He's always been a populist. And he is a populist now. And of course, yes, he's playing to the crowds, but he's doing things that need to be done. He's pushing through policies that are very effective that perhaps took an autocrat to push through. He's also looking abroad. He's founding colonies across the Mediterranean, in particular 2 cities that have been wiped out by the Romans a century before, the big city of Carthage and the city of Corinth, where he plants colonies, Roman colonies. And if they'd existed today, they would be in Greece and Tunisia. But I think there's also a sense that even after a few months back in Rome, even with everything he's doing, he's already bored. He finds Rome almost patriarchal. But also, I think he finds the problem of his position in Rome to be too great. Remember earlier that I spoke about Crassus, which is Caesar's former colleague in the triumvirate. Well, he'd been killed in a great battle by the Parthians. And Caesar decides, primarily because, as I said, I think he's getting bored in Rome, he decides he's going to lead a campaign against the Parthians, who would now be in northern Iran. And there's an element of emulating Alexander the Great. So there's actually a story that when Caesar is in his mid-30s, he sees a statue of Alexander and reflects that by his age, Alexander had conquered the entire world, and he, Caesar, had done nothing. And of course, it's actually hard to know whether that's actually a motivating factor for Caesar himself. Pompey has been definitely influenced by Alexander. I think Caesar less so, if truth be told. I think Caesar had sufficient confidence that really the inspiration for Caesar was Caesar. I think there's a sense in which he thinks in the East he can play the role of the king much more easily because there, people are happy to accept that a leader could be, this kind of new Alexander. And I think Caesar secretly wants that. By planning this campaign, he's kind of washing his hands of all the snarl, of all the pettiness, of all of that he sees in Rome, the resentments that he's having to face every time he goes into the Senate. The small people that are scribbling and scrabbling around trying to pull him down. So he plans a military expedition for which he's going to leave at the end of March. So his enemies, they have to decide what they're going to do about this. Because there's a sense in the months that followed his return to Rome in October 45 that, his enemies are they're torn between giving him honors to keep him happy and facing a series of incidents that provoke all kinds of outrage in them. So in late 45, they give him divine honors. They allow him to wear the name Imperator, which means victorious general, as his first name. And of course, then early in February, a really fateful step, he's appointed dictator perpetuus, dictator for life. And that really, for everyone in Rome who believes in the future of the Republic, is the kind of absolute death knell. Because if he is dictator for life that means there's no real prospect of restoring the Republic until he's gone. And a perpetual dictatorship implies a perpetual crisis in their minds. And it's not even as if it promises the Roman people a solution to its problems. It effectively says that they're permanent. And this is what gets his enemies thinking that they need to do something about this. But there are various kinds of other incidents that fuel it as well. And this is where you start to see Caesar not so much making mistakes, but maybe believing in his own immortality. So he starts, and this is crazy, he actually starts wearing the wrong shoes. He starts wearing high red boots, so kind of kingly boots. And it's not a good thing because that's what it signifies to the senators and to the people. And that was the start. And then on the 15th of February, a great festival is celebrated in Rome called the Lupercalia, which involves naked men running around the Palatine into the Forum, lashing bare-breasted women with goat thongs. I mean, different times. And usually it's young men who are doing this to young women. But on this occasion, there's a 40-year-old man who's doing it. This is significant. And this is the man who has been Caesar's great right-hand man and who in 44 BC is being appointed consul by Caesar. A man called Marcus Antonius, better known to us as Mark Antony. I mean, you can picture it. It's not a very nice picture, but you can picture it. He goes running around the Palatine, lashing breasts with his goat thong, and all that kind of stuff. And he comes into the Forum before the Senate House, which is actually in ruins because it burned down 8 years before. So there's kind of scaffolding and things around it while repairs are going on. But Caesar's actually sitting in front of it in a chair or in a throne. And as Antony approaches Caesar, the gathered crowd can actually see that Antony has in his hands the diadem that is entwined with laurel. And the diadem is actually a symbol of absolute monarchy. And Antony stands there and waits for applause, but there's none. And then Caesar, after moments of silence, orders Antony to put the diadem away. And as he does, the crowd erupts into tumultuous cheering. Caesar then says, "Take it to the temple of Jupiter, because Jupiter is the only king of the Romans." Antony then tries to press it on him a second time. And that's when Caesar says, "Rome will have no other king." So, look, if you're one of Caesar's critics, you think this has been a bit of a put-up job, wouldn't you? That Caesar was actually in on this, that he was hoping that the crowd would actually cheer as Antony walked towards him with the diadem, and he would then become king. And that's what his enemies are saying, that he misjudged the crowd. My hunch about Caesar's plans is that he didn't really care. I don't think he really cared whether he was king at this stage or not, because he was all-powerful. I think, as I've said, he's bored of everything to do with Rome, to be honest. He's spent so long abroad in the saddle on campaign that he finds the kind of pettiness of the senatorial elites a bit sad and a bit ridiculous. And I think he feels, that he can actually rule as dictator at home, that there's no opposition, but he can actually rule as a quasi-king if he goes abroad. He's not really that interested in the Republic anymore. So he notoriously says that the Republic is a nothingness and name only, and that it has no body, no substance. And I think that there is a kind of anxiety that he wants to be king, but I think it's also the feeling that his enemies have, that he despises them, and he despises everything that they hold dear and that they hold valuable. He's also pretty confident that he doesn't have to worry about them, because his hunch is that anything or anyone that replaces him will be worse than him. What's the old saying? Better the devil you know than the devil you don't. So as we come to March 44, we have Caesar, who is dictator for life. Mark Antony is a consul, but there's also a guy in the wings called Dolabella, who is a Caesarian, who is also a consul designate. So he's kind of scheduled to replace Caesar, when Caesar goes abroad as consul. but he's also the son-in-law of Cicero. I mentioned that praetors, these are the officials who are directly below the consuls in rank. There are two particularly distinguished praetors. One of them is the urban praetor, who is responsible for administrating Rome if the consuls aren't there, and he can only leave Rome for a maximum of 10 days per year. The urban praetor is Brutus. Then there is a praetor who essentially serves as a kind of the foreign minister or foreign secretary, kind of secretary of state. And this is a man called Cassius Longinus. And Cassius had fought with Crassus and had distinguished himself thereby bringing back the remnants of Crassus's defeated army. He had fought with Pompey as well, being his best naval commander. He had then been pardoned by Caesar, and he is a lean and hungry man, as Shakespeare describes him. Sadly, he's actually generally portrayed as an envious, ambitious, frustrated, embittered man. And I think he is. And I think there's a very strong element of that comes across. But of course, then there's also Cassius and Brutus, who are the main two people who convene the conspiracy. And there's actually a debate among the sources as to whether it was Cassius or whether it was Brutus. The version in Shakespeare, and therefore the one that's become canonical, is that it's Cassius who leads and Brutus has to be persuaded. But look, it's perfectly possible it's the other way around because, as I said, Brutus is the heir of the man who actually expelled the monarchy in the first place and therefore kind of feels he has a particular responsibility for it. And there's actually a lot of disputing the sources as to exactly how many conspirators there were. And it ranges from 80 to 15. But those sources could also reflect the situation. If you've got a conspiracy like this, you have a lot of people who are also vaguely aware of it and who are probably sympathetic to it, but they're actually not the prime movers in it. But they're waiting in the wings to actually see how things start to play out. And we actually have 4 principal accounts of Caesar's death. And of course, like the account of Jesus, they were written quite a long time after his death. But they clearly draw on contemporary sources. And I think the confusion that surrounds how many conspirators there were, who organized the conspiracy, what exactly happened, is actually reflective of the fact that conspiracies, by their very nature, are actually veiled in shadow. One person who's definitely not embroiled in it is Cicero, but somebody who is complicit in it is Decimus Brutus, who had fought with Caesar in Gaul. And it's very easy to confuse him with Marcus Junius Brutus, because it's of him that they said might have been Caesar's son. And on Caesar's last famous words, et tu, Brute, it's said and surmised that they were actually not said to Marcus Junius Brutus, his supposed son, but to Decimus Brutus, the man who served with him in Gaul. So on the night before the 15th of March, Caesar is having dinner with Decimus Brutus at the house of Lepidus. And the conversation turns to, what is the best death that you could possibly have? How best would it be to die? And Caesar answers abruptly and unexpectedly. And then he goes home. And the story is that he has this strange dream that he sees himself flying above the clouds, clasping at the hand of Jupiter. And his wife, Calpurnia, she imagines that she sees their house come crashing down. She holds her husband, she hugs him, and realizes that he's been stabbed. And then it's said that the doors of the bedchamber crash open by an unseen hand. And so in the morning, it's said that this makes Caesar a bit unnerved and he's a bit worried. And he decides that maybe he shouldn't go to the Senate, but then Decimus Brutus turns up and persuades him to go. The conspirators, well, they have to strike now. He's about to leave Rome very soon. He's leaving for Parthia. And if he had left for Parthia and had a triumphant campaign, their moment, the conspirators' moment, would well and truly have passed, because then surely he would be in a position to become king. I mean, whether or not he calls himself king is completely irrelevant. He would have been king in every sense bar name. So for them, it's sort of now or never. It's really interesting. I mean, they could have easily have employed someone to assassinate Caesar while he was on campaign. But what's interesting, and this again I think is what makes Caesar's murder so important in the annals of history, is that It's not done by some loner. It's not some agent. It's not some madman. It's not some paid assassin. It's the leading men of the Senate who do it. And that's what makes it so unthinkable. And they obviously, by this point, have a very clear plan. They're going to do it at the last meeting of the Senate before he goes off. And they're meeting at the theater of Pompey. This in itself is important because this is a political arena, and they want Caesar's death to be as public as possible. They're making a political statement rather in the way that Cato had done by ripping open his stomach. It's a spectacle of blood and liberty, and it can't be done in the shadows. It just can't be. He's effectively being sacrificed like a bull. You know, I said earlier that they were lavishing all these honors on him, that they're garlanding him, that they're leading him to the altar. This is exactly what's taking place. And their plans. So the very fact that I mentioned to you, the stories about the dream, that tells us something about the problems that we have with the sources. And that's because the stories about the dreams, well, they're all formulaic. I mean, doors crashing open, etc. They're all omens. And that probably didn't happen, but I think it leads to a fantastic Shakespearean story. But that being said, they might have done. I mean, maybe he had the dreams, maybe he woke up shaking, maybe the doors did crash open. We'll never know. But from what we know from the sources, the conspirators actually don't have any kind of progressive, practical plan for what happens after they've killed Julius Caesar. They just don't. I mean, they're not progressive in that way. All they want to do is kill him, but they actually don't know what's going to take place afterwards. No one seems to have given it any thought. And so in many ways, they're reactionary. And they assume that they will kill Caesar and that the Republic will just be restored and everything will go on as normal. And Cicero, who I think actually approves of the murder, I mean, the conspirators don't ask him because they're kind of worried that, he's not really the kind of conspiratorial type. He will say in due course that they behaved like men, but they planned like children. So they have no plan. There is no plan B. And what amazes me is that the conspiracy doesn't leak out. I mean, there are all kinds of, pre-sentiment. So famously, again, people who have seen the Shakespeare play will remember that there's actually a fortune teller called Spurinna who warned Caesar, beware the Ides of March. We all know that, right? Beware the Ides of March. And I actually don't know if that's fiction or if it's made up. I mean, Caesar's death is such a seismic event, and it's seen as one that reverberates through the heavens as well as through the earth, as we will see in due course. And it kind of upsets the entire fabric of the cosmos from the heavens to the earth. So going back to my thoughts on Spurinna, of course, everyone assumes that his death would have been foretold. So Caesar travels with Decimus Brutus to the theater of Pompey where the senators are meeting, and he apparently sees Spurinna. And he says, the Ides of March have come and here I am fine. And Spurinna turns around and says, they have come, Caesar, but they're not yet gone. And of course, this is what we glean from Shakespeare, and Shakespeare gleaned it from some very unreliable sources. But then Caesar goes into the Senate house, which Pompey had actually built as part of his great complex. There is a theater, there are gardens, and there is this incredible marble hall, which the senators are using as the Senate house. And of course, there's a large statue of Pompey there as well. Nearby, outside, there are games going on. People are playing games. Children are playing games. There are cheers. There are spectacles of blood with gladiators fighting in the distance. This is the kind of the background of what Caesar's walking into. And then Caesar walks into the Senate house itself, and these sounds dim. Of course, the conspirators are aware that there is a potential threat to them in the athletic figure of Mark Antony. And so one of the conspirators is employed to distract him and not to go in with Caesar, to delay him. And there are various people who are identified as having done that, but the likeliest candidate is a man called Trebonius, who will feature in due course later in the story. So Caesar goes in and the senators rise to greet him, a mark of respect that Caesar himself didn't show the senators a few weeks earlier when he was angry with them. He has a special chair if you can imagine, it's a kind of throne that the head of a committee would sit in. So the senators are kind of milling around, in their groups. And it's like the chair has actually walked into the committee. He's arrived, but everyone is still walking around and talking to each other. The meeting hasn't actually properly begun. And so there is actually scope at this stage for people to come up to Caesar and to ask him for favors. Because in the government, in the Republic of Rome, the only way things get done is by asking for personal favors. So if you want a favor done, you have to approach Caesar personally. And we actually don't know how many senators are there. But here's the thing. There are hundreds of them. At this point in history, there are at least 900 senators. But of course, they're not all going to be there. You never actually see that, do you, in the cinematic adaptations where there are sort of, 30 to 50 people. It's kind of, but what you have to imagine is a kind of House of Commons, House of Representatives type of thing. So there's people everywhere. So people come up to Caesar. And one of them is a guy by the name of Julius Caesar, who approaches with the petition, and then he grabs Caesar's toga. And then a guy called Casca stabs him below the throat, and then the blows start to rain down. According to Suetonius, who gives our best account, there are 23 wounds, of which, according to the doctor who then subsequently does the post-mortem on him, only one of those wounds had actually been fatal. And we get the detail from Plutarch that every conspirator has actually agreed to stab Caesar at least once. So, squaring those odds, adding them two together, there's effectively 23 conspirators. And of course, that's all very murder on the Orient Express. But the other senators who take part are forced to dip their hands in his blood as they leave. And I don't know whether that happens because, at the beginning of the podcast, I read an account to you of what Caesar said. That was given to us by Shakespeare. But if truth be told, I would say there would be mass confusion with people running and shouting and leaving as fast as they could because they would be worried about Caesar's legionnaires coming into the Senate, massacring the senators who were still there. Suetonius says that Caesar remained silent as the blows fell. Plutarch then says that he fell on his back as he saw Brutus coming towards him. And of course, Shakespeare says that Caesar's last words are et tu, Brute. You too, my boy, you too, my son. That's all very dramatic. And of course, then there's the question, which Brutus was it? Was it Marcus Jr. or Decimus? In the confusion, we'll actually never know. And the scene must have been so chaotic and so confusing that any attempt to impose order on the sources, it would have been a fool's errand because they probably would have given you a different account themselves, the conspirators, I mean, with regards to what actually took place. What is reported and which constant is that Caesar, as he dies, he pulls his toga over his head so that people won't be able to see his face in death. I think that's incredibly moving. And as his blood spills out, it laps the base of the statue of Pompey the Great. There's an irony in that, and everybody flees. The senators who were not in the conspiracy would be in a state of mass panic. And according to some accounts, there are some who were actually trampled to death in the chaos. As they leave, the conspirators who called themselves liberators hold their daggers aloft. Brutus calls out Cicero's name, implying that Cicero is the inspiration for this, and they all charge out, expecting to be greeted as liberators by the people. It doesn't happen. Caesar's body lies there, and Suetonius gives us the account that the chamber then empties, and Caesar's lifeless body lay there for a while, until 3 young slaves bundled it into a litter and carried it home, one arm dangling from the cart as it went. There you have it, folks, the incredible account of Caesar's murder. And it doesn't necessarily have to be over just yet. I'm actually playing with the idea of telling you what happens next. Are the liberators greeted with open arms? What does Mark Antony do? Some of you, I suspect, will know the answers to these questions already, but you haven't heard it told by me and my spin on it. So I may well put that together for you. Listeners, thank you as always for listening in. Remember, you can contact me on Review Mirror Chronicles, all one word, gmail.com. Keep the emails coming and let me know if you want to hear the continuation of what happened after the murder of Caesar, if that would interest you. Thanks again, everyone, and I will speak to you next week. Bye for now.